I'm not ready. Okay. So, Kevin, are you ready? Kevin's like, I don't know what I'm... So, so obviously the sexual revolution of the 60s was a big deal, but we have to go back to the garden too, because that's where it all began, really. That's where the revolution began against God, the revolt against God. And then you have to kind of, and there are so many more on the way, but another huge revolution, which I won't get into too much, but is the Genevan French philosopher JeanJacques Rousseau, who he was an 18th century philosopher, and his philosophy still reverberates with us today in such a powerful way. I mean, it touches every aspect of our culture now, because, and I'll get to it in a minute, but he, even in public schools and in crime and punishment, it touches all aspects of life. And I would say the majority of Americans are Rousseauians and don't even realize that they are. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously said, "Man is born free, but he is everywhere in chains." And what that means is, he thought man was born good. So when you get anthropology wrong, when you get that wrong, you get everything else wrong. So he did not believe in original sin. He believed that man was born good. He called him the noble savage. This wasn't an actual historical person, but this was a kind of like a test case in his mind. So the noble savage is the man in nature. So like a man on a deserted island by himself with no society around him is good. What happens, the reason man becomes corrupted is because he enters into society. And the society imposes its morality, its mores really and its traditions onto that person, and that's what corrupts that person. And so that's why the man becomes wicked. Now, Saint Augustine of Hippo, the famous church father, early church father, and brilliant guy, Augustine wrote a book. He wrote an autobiography called Confessions, and Rousseau wrote an autobiography called Confessions. And it's very interesting because in Augustine's Confessions, Augustine really developed the idea of original sin in the 4th century, I think it was. But so Augustine, when he was a boy, he stole pears from a market. He stole these pears with his friends, and he did it just for fun. And Augustine reflects on that in his Confessions, and he realizes how depraved he was and how sinful he was to steal those pears. Now, cut to centuries later, Rousseau steals asparagus. Weird. It's weird, these like fruits and vegetables that are going on. But so in his Confessions, Rousseau steals asparagus, and in his reflections on it, it's not his fault that he stole the asparagus. He stole it because an older man who was, this guy Virat, was, I think it was his mother's friend or something, asked him or needed it and wanted him to get asparagus for him. So in other words, it wasn't his fault. It was the fact that this guy wanted him to steal the asparagus. And that gets at the very root of where we are today. It's literally pears versus asparagus in our culture. It's like, do you believe that you're innately sinful, or do you believe it's the fault of society and the fault of the world? And so that's where we get this kind of victim mentality, where it's so. And so Rousseau, the noble savage, the born free, so for Rousseau, society is what is at fault, and that's what corrupts human beings, and the society's need to impose kind of these traditional sexual mores, sexual codes. And so that's why the idea of being your true self, be true, be who be true to yourself. That's the mantra of the day. That's a Rousseauian mantra. Because Rousseau, authenticity was one of the highest virtues for Rousseau. Being true to your real, authentic self, your noble savage. That's what Rousseau was all about. And so now, all these kids and all musicians and all these people who say, be true to yourself, that's Rousseau. They're not even aware that they're just imbibing and repeating what Rousseau would say. Because for Rousseau, being authentic was so important. And so Rousseau saw society as imposing these things on humans, which made them inauthentic. So they couldn't express their sexuality. They couldn't do whatever they wanted because there were these codes in society. And so anyway, all that is a preface to the 1960s sexual revolution. And the first slide was that's the sexual revolution. That's an image of it. And then we get to the pill, which was the first approved contraceptive in the United States that got approved in 1960. And the pill was cut the link between sex and diapers. And so that's really when people realized they could have sex with no consequences, really. And so that was a huge turning point in history. And then in 1969, as I mentioned earlier today, the Stonewall Inn, there were riots. The police raided the Stonewall Inn in 1969 on June 28th. Stonewall Inn is in New York, in Greenwich Village in New York City. It's a gay bar. It's still there. It's a museum now. I've been there several times. It's a creepy gay bar. But anyway, I never liked it, even though I was living that life. But and then after Stonewall, it got raided, the next night there were like the 3 nights after the riot or the raid, there were 3 nights of riots in New York, and that's what sparked the whole. This is what sparked the gay movement in the United States, was the Stonewall. And in 1970 were the first gay pride parades, the gay marches I mentioned earlier today, in LA, San Francisco, New York, and I think Chicago. And again, they were on June 28th to commemorate the raid in June the year before. And then in 1970s, that's when feminism really took root. I think it was that the second wave or third? Second wave of feminism took root. I think it was second wave. And Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, they were big figures in this movement. And that's when that's when feminism really, really took root. It started much earlier in the 1930s with Simone de Beauvoir. She wrote The Second Sex, and she was married or partners with Jean-Paul Sartre, which says, it's always the French that ruin everything, by the way. I mean, Rousseau, Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, they're always like wrecking things. And by the way, Rousseau his philosophy was the progenitor to the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was a disaster. It was the most horrendous thing. There's a book called Citizens by Simon Schama. It's all about the French. It's like this big. It's about the French Revolution, and it is utterly brilliant. It's the most brilliant nonfiction book I've ever read, except the Bible. But that's why the French Revolution, there was the Reign of Terror. All the Robespierre and the Jacobins, they ended up not only guillotining everyone who disagreed with them, but then they guillotined each other. And so everyone dies in the French Revolution, which is, if you look at 1789, the French Revolution, versus 1776, there's a dramatic difference. because the American Revolution was based on biblical principles. The French Revolution was based on Rousseauian principles. And that is why the French Revolution was such a disaster. And France is still a disaster today in general. Even though I love parts of France. I mean, who doesn't like a souffle? So then in 1972, there was a show called, there was a sitcom called Maude. You probably remember this, with starring B. Arthur, who was B. Arthur, if you don't remember, she was in The Golden Girls. She was B. Arthur in The Golden Girls. She played Dorothy Zmirnak, or whatever her name was. Zbornak. And so in Maude, this is in 1972 on primetime national television. There was a 2-part episode on abortion. And Maude, who in the episode she was, I think, 40, she was in her 40s, I think 47 at the time or something. But she gets pregnant. Unexpectedly, she gets pregnant by her husband. During the 2-part episode, she spends the entire time debating whether or not to keep the child. And her daughter, who's played by Adrienne Barbeau, who's a feminist, who's a single mother, and a feminist, and raising her child in her mom's house, her daughter spends the entire 2 episodes begging her mother to have an abortion. And at one point, she goes so far to say, "Mom, don't you get it? Having an abortion now is not a big deal. It's just like going to the dentist." And again, this is 1972. So do you see how the indoctrination is happening? Do you see how Roe v. Wade? Okay, so then in 1973, Roe v. Wade gets passed. Kel surprise. What a surprise. So then, after that, in 1977, there was a primetime comedy show called Soap. It was a spoof on soap operas, but it was a comedy starring Billy Crystal, among others. And Billy Crystal, Billy Crystal, he used to host the Academy Awards before they wouldn't let men do it anymore. And then, and so Billy Crystal, he was the first, his character named Jody was the first openly gay, he was the first openly gay character in a sitcom on TV. And I remember seeing this episode where he comes out, and I was a little kid, and I was so shocked by it. I was like, whoa, it almost felt, even though I was already same-sex attracted at that point, I could feel the evil coming from the TV. It was weird. So that happened in 1977. In 1978, Harvey Milk, the first openly gay candidate elected to political office in California, gets assassinated by his rival Dan Brown. Is it Dan Brown or Dan White? I always get them confused. Dan White? Brown? I don't know. Anyway, Dan. He gets assassinated, and so he becomes a gay icon, a gay hero, and that's why there was, we'll get to that in a minute. But in 1997, Ellen DeGeneres stars in her own sitcom called Ellen. This was before her talk show, and she was the first openly lesbian actress to play an openly lesbian character on television. And that had a huge effect on culture. I remember watching the episode where she comes out, and it was like the entire world was watching that episode, unless you were a Christian, maybe. And in 1998, shows like Will and Grace and Sex and the City had just launched, and that, of course, changed the landscape a lot. Sex and the City was created by friends of mine, and written by Sex and the City was not only created by a gay man, Darren Star, but the showrunner was gay. It was written by a lot of gay guys. So these gay guys basically imposed their gay sexuality on these women and made them just as promiscuous as gay men. That's because women. It's just crazy. My friends and I, we used to watch Sex and the City and be like, this is such a gay thing to do. Like, this is what gay guys do. This is not what women do. Anyway, so Sex and the City had a huge impact on culture. Will and Grace, obviously, as I mentioned this morning, had a huge impact. It really, really kind of normalized homosexual behavior in a big way, because it was like, these guys are hilarious, they're so funny, this is amazing. But the big turning point was in 2003, Queer Eye for the Straight Guy was a show, and that changed everything, because that was the first time not only women were watching, but women and their boyfriends, their straight boyfriends or husbands, were watching the show and loving it. And the husbands were like, this is hilarious, I love this is amazing. And I remember at the time, I was living as a gay man, and I told my friend, I was like, this show is the tipping point. This is where, because now even straight guys are starting to love gay characters, or this kind of situation. And so that was a big, big turning point in the culture. And then in 2005, Brokeback Mountain was a huge critical hit and commercial hit, and they played gay characters in the 60s, Jake Gyllenhaal and Heath Ledger. And Ang Lee directed the movie. It was like beautifully directed. But this movie had such a big impact on the culture as well. And then in 2008, Milk became a movie. So Harvey Milk, who was assassinated in 1978, his story got told by my friend Dustin Lance Black, who wrote the screenplay and won the Academy Award for it. And Sean Penn played Harvey Milk. And so that, of course, has a huge... And again, storytelling is the most powerful tool of persuasion. Because you can give as many lectures as you want, but when you watch a movie and you see a story, you're just so taken in by it. That's what humans, we love stories. And so it's such a powerful method to persuade people. And then, of course, the last thing I'll mention is in 2015, same-sex marriage becomes the law of the land. The U.S. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states. And that's kind of where we are today. I mean, we've gotten actually further along. It's gotten more extreme today. But anyway, I just wanted to take you through a brief journey through since the 60s to where we are today. And we have to remember, I always try to explain this to kids, young people. It's like you don't live in a vacuum. Like, you have no idea what you're being influenced by. You're being influenced by decades and decades and decades of indoctrination, and you're not immune to it. Yeah. This is you're taking this in, and you may not even be aware of it. So yeah.
We had kids in this church who are not here anymore, but where they said, "Why does Pastor Craig teach that homosexuality is a sin when everyone at school, they're at a public school, is saying it's cool? What's wrong with Pastor Craig?" I mean, they had no idea, and I guess their parents didn't say anything to them. But it's getting to where
those kids in public school are Rousseauians and Freudians without even knowing it.
Yeah, and they're
have
saying
no idea that they're buying into that.
Like you're saying, you need therapy if you say it's a sin. Remember, you said if people had told you at the Bible study, or at the coffee shop, that's the way these kids are looking at me like, you didn't get the memo, Craig. This is cool now, So, yeah.
Yeah, and telling those young people telling me that it was a sin was the most loving thing you can do. Yeah. They say my eternity was saved because of, you know what I mean? I mean, I know God is sovereign, but I love the fact that they told me the truth. Loving your neighbor means telling them the truth. Because if you separate love and truth, it's meaningless. Love is meaningless. Like the phrase "love is gibberish. It's a postmodern phrase that means nothing, and it doesn't. It's also a tautology, because you can't define a word by the same word. Love is not love. Love. The best definition of love is Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing. That's a good definition of love. It does not rejoice in. So when you're celebrating gay pride or you're posting gay affirming things, you're rejoicing in wrongdoing. That's not love. That's unloving. So anyway, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent.
I always say this is that love without the truth is liberalism, but truth without love is legalism. So you need that perfect balance of speaking, like you said, faithful to wounds of a friend better than the kiss of an enemy.